listeners, I'm Sam with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar, our host Amjo Hall is joined by Michael Hardt, political theorist and professor at Duke University. Am and Michael discuss the concept of political love, Michael's research on revolutionary movements in the 1970s, as well as his past writing with the late Tony Negri, and how they continue to think together. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We have our special guest this week, Michael Hardt, joining us. Welcome, Michael.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Michael, maybe we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Myself. I don't know what to say about myself. I teach at Duke University in the U.S. I write generally, I suppose, about political theory and contemporary political movements. I think that's all I can think about myself.
Yeah, great. And of course, you were just here in Vancouver in December, talk about your wonderful book on the subversive 70s. And it was great to be in conversation with you. And as I had mentioned, I've been working on a book with my friend around friendship and community and how to rethink some of those debates and conversations from the 80s and much earlier around forms of authoritarian populism that are circulating today, and also around the broader ecological questions and how they bring forward today. And as I was sort of rummaging through the internet and other places, I came across a number of your lectures that you're doing, almost like 20 years ago on love, around the political concept of love. I think a number of years ago, I may have seen you give a talk at Banff around the same topic a little bit after that. And I was quite intrigued because I think as I was going through a bunch of reading around friendship and community, of course, come across notions of love and solidarity in all of those things. But I wanted to, before I jump into all of those things around love in terms of what you were thinking about then and how you think about it today, but I just want to talk a little bit about your own. You've spoken before in the past about situations of political struggle that you came out of in the 70s. You've got the 70s book, but also out of the 80s, and things that sort of contributed to your own political orientation and approach to political questions.
Well, maybe one way to start about that, I was not a precociously politicized person. Many people in high school are already deeply engaged in movements. And it was really in my 20s that I began finding my way into modes of activism that worked for me. And really the beginning of it, and this is maybe the part that's relevant for us, is around migration in the U.S. I was involved in a movement in the U.S. that at the time was called the Sanctuary Movement, which was really the idea was bringing people from El Salvador and Guatemala that needed to leave because of U.S.-sponsored wars, bring them to the U.S., clandestinely or illegally, and have them housed in churches because the immigration services wouldn't deport them from churches. And then progressively, I moved with the movement first to Mexico City as a sort of contact person for coming north, and then to El Salvador. And there was a helpful shift for me. And maybe if I'd been smarter or in different circles in the U.S., it would work then. But in the U.S., doing activism at the time, there felt to be a kind of moral quality to that activism and that felt very, a kind of outrage that drove the activism and which justified and everything, and a kind of moral overtone to it, what really shifted for me participating with Salvadoran movements at the time during the Civil War is the discovering what for me was a joy of struggle. It didn't seem like either an obligation or a moral duty or a sort of, involving myself in a sense of condemnation, but the joy of struggle and joy of struggling together was something that I learned through the process. And maybe that could be an introduction to this question about love and politics, that recognizing political struggle, not as a duty, or not only as a duty maybe, and not only aimed at its ends and effects, but the joy of the collective process of political struggle. It was an important thing for me. I'm not sure if it's even completely understandable the way I'm explaining it. This is the way in my own mind, the historical reconstruction of it was. And it very much shifted for me for, subsequent decades, my orientation towards both participating in and theorizing in movements. The joy, discovering that joy and holding on to that joy as a principle of political action.
Yeah, so I wanted to, in terms of questions about love, we're a few days from Valentine's Day, but I want to differentiate. We're not talking about romantic love here, but a political conception of love. And when you were giving talks and doing some writing about it, almost 2 decades ago, a little bit less than that, I'm wondering if you can sort of begin with just sharing about what were you thinking about then that became an important part to start thinking about and articulating in a theoretical way.
One component of it was that I felt like in activist communities, that I participated in, and it was also a period, maybe that period has continued, where I find myself able to be with very many different activist communities. In other parts of the world, it was a period I sort of had the privilege of being able to, everywhere I went, even sometimes for academic reasons, I could always have access to the activist communities in whatever town. And so one of the things that I recognize is with younger activists, of a different generation than me, the notion of love was part of the vocabulary of the activism itself, like that they knew exactly what I was talking about when I would talk about both joy and love, and it seemed to be directly part of their experiences, where I had a great deal of trouble discussing this in other more theoretically defined contexts, both academically and others, and being understood, like what were the kind of reactions I would get? Like, well, of course, one reaction was, Michael, you spend too much time with Italians, as a kind of like thing, or that, that sounds religious to me, the notion of love in politics, or this, like you were just suggesting, this conflation with the romantic. I mean, I think that they are in some ways related, but that seemed to depoliticize the question, I think, in certain contexts. And so I had a great deal of trouble. I felt like being understood. In fact, it blocked me. You're right that I did for a certain period use the opportunity to try to explain what I meant, try to theorize what I meant about love and politics. But when I tried writing, and I've never really written about it, Tony Negri and I, in joint books we wrote together, have brief sections about it. But I felt like he too, the two of us were frustrated by what seemed to us a difficulty of the topic, which discouraged me from really writing about it. I felt like I couldn't work through it. And in some ways, perhaps in conversation like here with you, that can work better, because then we can work out what we're intending by this. It's not like we need different. Well, I don't know. I'm rather insistent on not trying to resort to different terminologies, I don't know, in a certain activist and Christian context, you'd say, okay, well, we're talking about agape. Okay, fine. But I'm rather tied to understandings we have of love and in some ways to orient the term, hold on to the term and orient it towards what we mean by it. Well, I mean, what I mean by it. There you go.
And, there's that, the distinction between agape and eros, and that becomes a beginning point in a number of ways, at least in the way that I encounter it, the different ways that we can think of a political concept of love and how it might differentiate or differ from friendship or community, or in the case of some thinkers like Alain Badiou, he views it as sort of part of a truth procedure, and these notions of intense transformative fidelity come out of love, or it has a relation to psychoanalysis for him as well. But let me start with that then, is like, how might we differentiate political concept of love from friendship in community? Jean-Luc Nancy passed away a few years ago, and he was writing, of course, a lot on friendship. But wondering if you could maybe share some thoughts just around that proximity.
I do think the relationship with friendship and the way that you two are writing about friendship in your book too, it's not dissimilar. And it might be idiosyncratic for me. Like, let's try and work through this. That for me, what is important about, well, actually, let's back up a minute, because I think this is something about friendship and love, both, and joy that's important to consider. now I'm going to just say something that's totally obvious, but it's usually good to start with such things, which is that, doing politics is obviously not just about interests and even always outcomes. That politics is also about the passions, and that, negotiating the passions is a central part of political theorizing and political action. I mean, it's sometimes helpful to get the me sentimental of our theorists, and maybe we come back to them, actually. Machiavelli, I was thinking of. I can't think of anyone less sentimental, except maybe Spinoza, who's also writing about love and not particularly sentimental either. But anyway, let's leave those aside and get to the, start with the more immediate things. For me, friendship, the distinction that's useful to me is that in friendship, of course we are transformed in friendship. Like with any encounter, we are transformed. But for me, love is a real losing of our previous selves. So that in the kind of transformation we go through in love is one of the things that seems very important to me. And so you might say, this is why I was hesitating about the terminology. You might say, well, okay, in friendship, that's also equally true. And if it is, then look, let's just use the terms interchangeably in this far. But that's one of the things that I hold on to about the word, and I guess the concept of love is its transformative character. I guess there would be two basic things. One is that recognizing love as a bond. Love is the strongest of bonds, even, and then love as even a process in which you are radically transformed. At least sometimes people can understand friendship as I am me and you are you, and we form a kind of connection or an alliance, but it doesn't really change who we are. I keep stuttering here almost because I recognize friendship is a rather capacious concept that has very different definitions. So, but anyway, that's where I would start with. At least it's that, both the strength of the bond and the transformative character that I identify in political experiences. I both think it from a political, theoretical perspective, but also in a practical one. Even just appealing to you. Anyone can think about their own political experiences, and the ones that I think are most successful, or ones that we recognize with most success, are ones in which we found ourselves transformed, and in which we created seemingly unbreakable bonds. Something profound bonds. Let's call it that way.
Yeah, when we were working on the book, one of the people we spoke to was Leela Gandhi, and it was interesting about, her kind of refusal to define friendship, but also friendship as the possibility of something unproductive, kind of useless. There was a friendship can be productive, but it can also be useless. There doesn't need to be an outcome in the way that love or a relationship, or say a comradely relationship might be. Jodi Dean's comrade, of course, distinguishes as well that, there's a political solidarity built into the bond where you may not even necessarily like each other, but you have each other's back. In the case of friendship, you might just do the durability of time, nobody so long, even though your politics might not be the same, but you can still be friends. And so there's a series of distinctions that can kind of play out, and we define those, I suppose, all in our own ways. One of the things that and I wonder if you could speak to any of that, but also in your lectures, you spoke about, in a way, that love is a form of excess or a form of exclusion in terms of how we might relate to nation, ethnicity, tribe, these kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that aspect of, love of an excess or something overdone, or a distorted love even.
I think I know. Stop me if I'm going down the wrong track, but it's certainly true that love could be a horrible and destructive force. I think I'm thinking of an essay by Sarah Ahmed, but it's something one can recognize quite quickly, where it's, we often talk about fascist groups, reactionary groups as being based on hate, and certainly hate plays part in it. But it might be more useful actually to think about them as based on love. The love of whiteness, the love of us, the love of, and I think that it's useful. It shouldn't discount the concept for us. It should force us to have distinctions, I guess, within what political forms of love can entail or should entail. And I think that the love of the same, the love of the self, it would seem to me a qualitatively different. It doesn't seem to me difficult to make a distinction. Like when someone would say to me or say to you or say something like, oh, but those people too, they're also based on love. But it's a horrible form of love. And it's an easily distinguishable form of love. What would be, I would say, a revolutionary form of love has to be involved in a love of differences, a love of getting outside of, not only outside of yourself, but outside of the same. And I'm saying this in very, abstract terms, but I don't know, it seems to me it doesn't seem that complicated what I'm saying, especially if one were to start with, like I was saying, like Sarah Ahmed was doing in this essay, which was, start by looking at these white supremacist groups, recognize what they're acting on in terms of love, and don't allow that to therefore discredit love, like, oh, okay, therefore love's horrible, but rather allows you to make a certain kinds of distinctions, so that once we're then going to come say, well, what is a kind of political love that we want? It allows us to, start and it, not only what we want, what we do. In some ways, that's the way I've felt entirely with this project. That's why I started from that perspective about recognizing the way activists that I knew, especially younger activists, talked. It's not. So I feel like I'm not inventing something, even inventing a discourse that's outside. I'm just really trying to understand in some way systematically what's already present. And I imagine you felt that with friendship too.
Absolutely. It was the sort of the term in the room that we mentioned but didn't quite get to in a way, but it seems to be the next question in a way. And another one that comes up, I'm teaching a course in political violence and the right to move right now. And one of our guests last night is Svetlana Matviyenko, who's a wonderful cyber war theorist who, happened to be in Ukraine visiting her parents when the Russian invasion happened. And we've talked a number of times just around notions of solidarity, how to remake solidarity, the relationship between solidarity and politics and love and friendship, and how to draw that distinction. And Astor Taylor has a book out right now with Leah Hendricks. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but there seems to be a lot of conversations related to solidarity as well. And maybe we can put that term into the frying pan as well in its relationship to love. And maybe solidarity has a relationship closer to comrade than to love. But I'm wondering how you might think through the concept of solidarity.
Yeah, here too, I would start with the distinction. Yeah, here's another. Sorry that I think in these theoretical references, but I was thinking, you remind me of Rosa Luxemburg's book on the 1905 revolution. And in that book, she's speaking, at a certain point to the German left and saying, look, you all say you have solidarity with the Russians in their revolution, but that's not good enough, because you're understanding solidarity as something external. Like our poor cousins, I want to help them kind of thing. What you have to recognize, she says, to the German left, is no, their struggle is really your struggle. So that you need to have solidarity with them, but not solidarity as an external thing, but really as an internal project. Like you need to understand, and maybe now you could say it could be that the different contemporary notions of solidarity we're talking about in comradeship already have that. But it does seem to me a useful starting point of how we understand solidarity, not as a sympathy or here's another example of the same thing. I don't know if it helps too. I was thinking of an essay by Iris Young, socialist feminist in the early 1980s. And she addresses her male, comrades. She's addressing the ones who have sympathy for is mostly in the labor movement, who have sympathy for the feminist struggle. But she says, I don't want your solidarity if what your solidarity means that, you see our struggle as separate from yours and you're going to give us support or something. What you have to recognize is that the struggle against patriarchy is really your struggle against capital too. Like you have to recognize that these are really part of the same thing. And then I want your solidarity. Yeah, all I'm getting at here, maybe it's too simple a point. I think solidarity is often used maybe in common parlance as a kind of thing. You're like, I don't know, I feel solidarity with the Palestinian people. They're all getting killed. It would be a different thing to have solidarity with the Palestinian people and recognize that their struggle is your struggle. I don't mean that you have to give up what you're doing and become part of their struggle. No, that your actual struggle is that they're related. I mean, it's partly not that they're related, that they're intrinsically related, that the powers that they're both addressing are intertwined and mutually constitutive.
I wanted to speak a little bit around, you spoke about it earlier, but I want to go into that question a little bit around at least the theological description of love can denote a kind of love as a charity, love as a kind of towards another, versus the proximity and relation between love and justice, and how we might parse that out a little bit.
I have found in discussions that the theological traditions on love can feel like a trap. I mean, because on the one hand, like when I'm just thinking by myself, or when I used to think with Tony, or reading, I do think there's a great deal that one can learn from the Christian and Judaic and traditions of the ones I know. I assume I think from all of the theological traditions, there are ways in which there are aspects, of the way love is configured that can be useful. But like I say, the difficult thing, and here we are speaking with listeners, which is that too often I find that once one includes a theological description, many listeners just now say, close down the question because, okay, that there's some, I don't know, Michael must become a Christian now, and I don't know what, or something like that. I don't know exactly what the way of doing it is. Within the Christian tradition, there's a wide and varied notions of love that seem to me either directly political or applicable to politics. This is both in Jewish theology and Christian theology, is this question about what love of neighbor means. And the love of neighbor, one thing I like very much, a formulation of it, is an explanation. This was in, I believe it is Rosenzweig's very mysterious book called The Star of Redemption. And he says, what the love of neighbor really means is love for an empty place that could be filled by anyone. So it's not like love of neighbor, like there's a specific neighbor and that there is a kind of bond to that, but that what the mandate is, I don't want to call it a commandment, what the mandate is to be able to construct a kind of openness of a relationship to love that has plural possibilities. Yeah, so I like this notion of the neighbor not being an object or even a specific subject, but being, like I said, this empty place that can be filled. That can be filled by anyone.
Yeah, it's definitely an interest in how we define the neighbor. Who's the neighbor? It definitely opens up a question of the approach to another, and sort of alongside that is the kind of tradition of the love of the stranger. Or we can get into, Derrida's notion of hospitality, but the love of the neighbor might be there's a proximal kind of orientation, but with the love of difference, it becomes the love of the stranger. And how do we love those who we don't know? How do we look across identity and difference and to approach a situation with love? And once we talk about that in a kind of leftist orientation, people also kind of roll their eyes towards that. It can sound theological, as you said. And, what does that allow for in terms of political possibility if we can think of love of the stranger in a kind of political context?
Well, it's certainly a kind of inoculation against what I was talking about earlier as a kind of, let's just call it white supremacist love, just to give it that thing, which is, love of the same or love of identity or something like that, which because that's one way one can interpret love of neighbor. Love of the neighbor is the one who is closest to you. So it's not really, it's a kind of false getting outside of yourself. The only getting outside of yourself insofar as it's really what's most proximate to you. So that this notion about, love of the stranger, I love that formulation. I would identify that with Walt Whitman as much as with someone else. Yeah, maybe rather than a formula that has its own practical output, it's more like a way out of notions of love that remain closed, within one identity, but even within one community, within sameness in the more abstract sense. It doesn't yet, and at least as we're talking now, I don't see quite yet how it can, this love of the stranger, when that has to be filled in some way. Yeah, so here's a more practical way to do it. Come back to Rosa Luxemburg or the Iris Young thing about, when she is saying, like, we in our feminist movement don't want your sympathy, like with the love of the stranger, so that these men in the socialist movement who were, not the whatever, the worst ones, but to be able to get outside of, love of the most proximate, they need a conceptual understanding of how their struggle and the power structures they're against are intimately interwoven with these other power structures, so that the feminist movement isn't to them, it might be a stranger I'm still working through these terms, but it's a stranger that they can recognize where they're struggling together, where they need to be struggling together. Hey, I'm fumbling a little bit, but I do think that without that, just that formula, love of the stranger, it could just sound like a bland, you should love all of humanity, or you should love all of that exists, and, fine, but that doesn't really, to me, translate into political project. So anyway, all that partly to say that I like this love of the stranger as a kind of inoculation against a destructive forms of love, but I think that it then needs to be filled with some content, but with a content that doesn't have to mean, it turns out you are the same as me. It has to be actually, yes, you're different. Ultimately, our political projects are necessarily tied. I feel like that some content like that has to be filling it. The same way that I think it's the same principle when I was saying with Rosa Luxemburg and thinking about the Russians who are, who tried and failed. They're foreigners, they are strangers, but she wants them to be recognized as part of the same struggle. Yeah, that you can have strangers together in struggle. Maybe that's what. But it's the together in struggle that's still necessary for me to allow that. Yeah.
There's aspects of when you were giving these lectures, many years ago. It's also this notion of the kind of love as a kind of refusal of the couple or the family. And family is this thing that we inherit. We don't have a choice of who our family is. Love or hate them, they're your family. But we have this term of, chosen family or these kinds of aspects, but also these notions of love, be it homosexual love, be it polyamory, be it all these aspects that oftentimes when love is too stringently defined, has its limitations or orthodoxies or limits political potential even within those confines. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think, I was saying earlier that on the one hand, so often I find that the recourse back to romantic notions of love in order to explain the political love really can disrupt, get the discussion off track. But like you're saying, one should be able to, or it's true that one should be able to think about, and maybe sometimes sometimes it's on parallel tracks. Let's put it this way. There are certain notions of romantic love that, there's a long tradition of this. What love means is that we merge into one. Like, I become you, you become me. I don't know. I can think of a classic poem by Goethe about these two lobes of a leaf, that we're part of the same thing. Yeah. And so both, in romantic terms, I find that disgusting, but that's actually beside the point for today. But if you would think of, there is a kind of parallel track of thinking that a political form of love has to be about the play of differences, about not just negotiating differences, but forming bonds that recognize differences. I mean, sometimes you could think about what, the nature of just what I was trying to think a few minutes ago about what seemed to me horrible conceptions of the romantic couple. There's a resonance or a parallel path. I guess I would go with the political notion. I mean, the family. Yeah, I have a similar disgust for the family. I mean, not because it's not chosen, but because it's a repressive institution. I mean, I'm sure you love your family. I love my family, whatever, but if one steps back and thinks about the family and recognizes it as a repressive institution, it might be a guard against trying to translate that into politics, and thinking comradeship as in family terms, like creating even this notion of a chosen family or such like thing. I think it's just, that's maybe it's a different conversation I'm entering onto here about the institution of the family and the need to abolish it. But maybe the sensible thing that, bracketing off another discussion for another time, is just that in many ways that it can provide, at least for me, a kind of helpful getting beyond difficulties to think also about the diversities among romantic forms of love and ways that they help us see past obstacles we're finding in the questions of political love. Where I was just hesitating just now, and I don't know if this, let me just try it. If it doesn't work, we let it go, which is that the thinker who I had found super helpful about this and posing the relationship even is Alexandra Kollontai, early Soviet feminist and political leader and such. And Kollontai is really arguing against love and the couple as effects of property ideology. She says that the bourgeois couple is really a property relation. You are mine, I am yours, that we can't understand the bonds to each other except in property terms. We've been property has made us so stupid, as Marx liked to say, that we can only see bonds as property relations. And so, and it's not that Kollontai meant by that, we should not have bonds with each other, or, she also wasn't, people sometimes read her as being, against monogamy for that reason. I don't think she cared less who you had sex with or how many people you had sex with. It's rather the nature of the bonds we have with each other. So what she proposed is a form of red love, like the Soviet, she thought that we need to invent a new love that's a communist love, no longer a bourgeois love. And she's primarily thinking about property relations, even our relationship to children. She says, like there's a bourgeois notion of children as property. And in fact, that you only take care of them because they're yours. Like that's someone else's kid. Okay, they can starve because they're not mine. They're not my responsibility because there's a property relation that's defining it. She has a number of interesting things to say, but I think even just the provocation is interesting. Like what would be a communist notion of love, even at the level of the couple? That's where she's starting, the couple and the family, the relationship, intergenerational relationships. If we don't have property relations to bind us, or even a property imaginary, of our bonds to each other. As I'm presenting it now, I realize I'm presenting it just as an open question, but a useful one. So anyway, the way I started down that road is that she is someone who is relatively successful, it seems to me, at trying to think love in the couple and political relations of love. But there are few who are good at that. I'd say that's a very difficult negotiation.
Yeah, and in some sense, too, as you've sort of remarked or hinted upon, that to have subjectivities capable of democracy, of small d democracy, we need to have love and joyful encounters to create a kind of durable horizon. In a way, I want to come back for a moment. Like Badiou writes about love in a particular sense, and it's a rigid sense as a truth procedure. But I want to kind of maybe bring up his notion of fidelity, this notion of, the world changes, but it's that intense fidelity that helps form a political subjectivity. And could there be something there attached to love that we could maybe think through?
Right. Yeah. So you're suggesting, we shouldn't think about fidelity in terms of the couple or fidelity in terms of some other, but rather fidelity to the event, that we maintain a constant relationship to a constant orientation towards even, the events, political events that we want to affirm. I think that's right. I'm trying to think through if that's true to Badiou's formulation. He poses events like Christ's death as an event, that Christians are faithful to in that sense, or maybe a revolutionary moment as an event that we have fidelity to. The term fidelity hasn't worked for me particularly well because it sounds too much like an obligation rather than as a affirmation of desire. Do you know what I mean? But this is not, I'm not saying that that's what Alain Badiou means, but, when we talk about fidelity in common speech, it is often abiding by an external obligation, regardless of your own desires, so that you, and that's what I would like the fidelity to mean, the kind of fidelity that you're referring to in his work is that we are pursuing joy. Yeah, okay, let me translate Badiou into Spinoza here. But I give a very simple Spinoza example. So Spinoza defines joy as the increase of our power to think and act. When we sense joy is when we become more, try just the thinking part. We become able to think more clearly. And that love, then, for Spinoza, is the experience of joy with the recognition of an external cause. So that I recognize that there's some external cause that creates that joy in me, and then I want to pursue that. So I think of this just in super simple terms. Like most people that I have political conversations with, I feel like I come to the conversation knowing what I'm talking about, and progressively I get more and more confused. I feel like I become more stupid. That's a better way of putting it. But then every once in a while, you meet somebody or a group of people with whom the encounters with them are entirely joyful in the Spinozian sense. Like I can think better when I'm with these people, and I can act better when I'm, when I'm with these people. And essentially what Spinoza is saying is like, hold on to those people. Those are, they bring you joy, which isn't here it isn't a question of pleasure in a passive sense. It's a matter of an active capacity, so those people bring you joy. You hold on to them. That's love, because you recognize that they are the cause of your joy. That might be a fidelity. Like maybe we could call that fidelity, but there, of course, it's clearly not a fidelity based on some moral obligation, like I got married to somebody, and even though I don't want them anymore, I should be faithful to them, or I don't know, whatever, something like that. It's rather, these are encounters that bring me joy, and that you should pursue them as so long as they bring you joy. Otherwise, then, at least in the very geometrical Spinoza formulations, then that falls apart. And it's true, it does. I mean, there are relationships, or even thinks of it in terms of banal terms like study groups. Like we form a study group sometimes, and it's fantastic. It's rare, as you know, but when you continue it, like you do continue it because it keeps bringing you joy, like keeps making you able to think better. At a certain point, it might not. They dissolve too. Is that still fidelity? I think it might be. If fidelity, see, that's the other thing about fidelity that bothers me about the term. But I'm not criticizing Badiou here. I don't think I'm actually probably saying anything different than him. I'm just that the colloquial use of the term both for me seems to involve an external obligation and a permanence. There's no reason to think of any of these things as forever. There's decomposition just as much as there's composition. And so anyway, I would say fidelity, if I'm going to use it this way, fidelity means pursuing your joy as long as it lasts.
I wanted to jump a little bit and to thank you for that wonderful conversation, because I think as you're thinking out loud about these questions that you were thinking through years ago, I'm in a similarly perplexed position. And so it's really useful to talk through it. But I wanted to spend just a little bit of time. I have your book right here with me. You came to do a talk generously in Vancouver in December, but wondering if you could, for our listeners who may not have had a chance to read it as of yet, if you could speak a little bit about this project and where it came from.
So the project is really trying to work through together revolutionary movements in the 1970s in as many countries and contexts as I could, because I had the two senses maybe to start the project. One is that I felt like there's a there is a political coherence to it, despite the diversity of the movements. Things happening in South Africa and South Korea and Chile, France, North America, et cetera, that there was a continuity that allows us to think them together. And the other is a kind of continuity among different movements or sectors of the movement, between gay liberation at the time, between feminist movements, between anti-racist movements, between labor movements, et cetera. And so that was a kind of working on a kind of accumulation, and all of that with the belief or anticipation that we today have something to learn from them, from these movements of the 1970s. So I guess maybe one of the premises about that is that the general historical commonplace is that, the last revolutionary moment that was experienced was the 1960s, especially in the dominant parts of the world. And so that is held as like, that's what revolution is. And I think, of course, revolutionary movements in the 1960s, were important in many ways and transformative. But my contention is that they are really a part of our past. And that instead, the movements of the 1970s and the 1970s in general are the beginning of our present. I guess I mean by that two separate things. One is that the forms of domination, that there was a shift that often is remarked upon, and much is written about the shift in the forms of domination in the 1970s, that define our current era. Think of the general writings about neoliberalism beginning in 1973 in Chile, or 1979 or 8 with Thatcher's election, whatever, something like that. Or shift from Fordism to post-Fordism, the deindustrialization of the dominant countries. You can think of a variety of other ways that we think of that. But it's more important for me is that I would say the 70s are really the beginning of our era, because the political problems they individuated, the political problems they faced, continue to be our political problems. It's with those sorts of mandates or interests that I try to work through what I find most inspiring in the political movements in different countries. I'm no historian. I don't pretend to be an historian, even though this sort of project might require an historian. I'm able to think politically, or I feel like I'm a political theorist, maybe is a way of saying it. But it's really that I'm also interested in thinking with the movements, like thinking or understanding the problems posed by activist movements today, and what are the kind of dead ends they run into, and what are the kinds of possibilities that these references, were recalling what these movements in the 70s had done, might be helpful for.
One of the interesting things you said in Vancouver towards the end of your talk was just, because a number of those political movements didn't achieve the political ends that they articulated, or fell onto moments of political exhaustion or closure, or the kind of meta-political environment closed in on them, that we shouldn't read them completely as failures, but that they opened up a political horizon at the time where the political conditions are right, that we have a lot to learn from them in terms of inspiring the present. And I thought that was a nice linkage. In a way, I suppose I could link that back to Love and Fidelity in a kind of way. But I thought that was an interesting aspect of what we learn. I know Assad Haider has been writing a lot about exhaustion lately and those types of things. And there's a couple of books that are kind of adjacent. Well, Glenn Coulthard was on that panel, and he's writing a sort of prehistory to his Red Skin, White Mask, but movements that get into the early 70s, including AIM and others. The Red Africa book as well, out from Verso, goes into the early 70s. And just, for the parts that you weren't able to, it's an expansive book in and of itself, but of course it can actually speak to these areas that you weren't able to get to as well. And just wondering if you could speak to the kind of conversations that have opened up as a result of the book coming out, or what new thinking that you have now that you've had other people encounter the book.
Yeah, let me start just with that first part, because it was important to me to recognize, because I felt like that was one of the obstacles to thinking about these revolutionary movements in the 70s, which is that they were all defeated. That it's not as if we're writing about the Soviet victory, or even some ways. Well, okay, I mean, it's different with 68 in different places, but it's I think the movements that I'm talking about in that area were primarily defeated. And the conceptual distinction I make just for myself is between failure and defeat, because the way I understand failure is that it results from an internal flaw. Movements fail when they have when there was something wrong with them. In some ways, a failure is a dead end. Because it's you've realized what couldn't go on. And instead, these movements, I would say, were defeated. To be defeated is not a failure, because it's not referring to an internal flaw. It's referring to a superior external force. Forces of repression. But as we know, in the 1970s and today, forces of repression come in a variety of ways. I mean, there's actual military repression, but there's also all kinds of strange ideological repression, ways movements are defeated in other ways. So anyway, defeats aren't dead ends, it seems to me. Defeats pose the possibility of kind of a jumping off point. And that's why I found it most interesting of looking, of understanding these movements. And you're right, Glenn's work in this period is fascinating and super useful in exactly the same way. I mean, that it poses, a kind of, it's not just inspiration, that feels too thin to me when one says, I'm inspired by it, but rather that it provided a plateau that they arrived at that we can use to go further. And like I was saying earlier, this is because the problems they were facing were the problems that we're facing today. Talking with other people about it, you're right, that is, I mean, that's always the pleasures of these sort of creating encounters around a book, is finding people who are, doing actually even more interesting work on the same topic you wanted to do, or have allied projects. And I think it is, there's a lot of interest in the 1970s that, in some ways I'm just feeding into some, I would say, a sort of wave of interest, especially in feminist circles. Interest in the 70s is a definite thing. Anyway, that's been part of the pleasure, seeing people doing similar work. There's, let me just try one other thing. I'm not sure if this really fits. It's partly in response to a French film that I saw the other night, a new film, but one that things I've been thinking while writing the book helped clarify this for me. And references, I feel like there's often, this was this film was, it's called L'Établi, it's about the students who went to the factories after May 68 and established themselves there. That's what they mean by L'Établi, the established ones in the factories, with the idea that they could then go, make revolution there. And so it has a certain sense at the time, and I find it, interesting. It's based on a manuscript written then, by someone who had done this. But I feel like today it functions as a kind of nostalgia for not only the factory and not only for the period in which there was imagined that the industrial worker could be the central protagonist in the entire revolutionary struggle, but a kind of nostalgia for a time when politics was clear, like on which side you're on, like that it was clear, okay, you want to make revolution? I know what you do. You go to the factory, and they're the good, you can ask which side are you on, and it's very clear you're on this side or that. Today, and this is true, certainly true of the 1970s, why many people find them difficult, the revolutionary movements in them, is that is a very difficult question. The political context is much more complicated. There aren't two sides. There's a great deal of ambiguity. One can't simply choose one or the other. In fact, one of the great things I would say of the 1970s is exactly what's lamented in many accounts, which is that what was called at the time the centrality of the industrial worker. The assumption that, like I said a minute ago, that the industrial labor force, the industrial working class, would be the leader of the revolution. That was destroyed, in part by capital's restructuring and exporting of production from the dominant parts to other parts of the world and automation, etc. I think that was a hugely beneficial event, rather than having nostalgia for the clarity of a previous period, either the 1930s. I feel like that's often also what the 30s dredge up as a kind of nostalgia for a political clarity, or for this, even, the period in the second half of the 20th century of the leadership of industrial labor. I think that it was a great opportunity that forced us to create, in every movement even, the openness to a multiplicity of struggles and to work out the articulation among them. And that's hard. I understand people wanting. So anyway, the project has clarified certain things for me that had previously just generated irritation in me, which I didn't know how to express. See, that's not a bad thing, actually, in life, is learning how to explain why you become irritated when you become irritated. Oh, maybe this is a surprise, actually, because I did. So as part of, after the book was published, I went in some university context. I went to some, bookstores, and I also went to some, activist spaces and such. And I was surprised, not a majority thing, but I was surprised that in some sectors, the movement, I still encounter I guess what they would call a class first position. Not always, sometimes even a class only position, but mostly a class first position, which says, oh yeah, Mike, all this stuff you're saying, it's right, but the primary struggle is really against capital. And, that's what we need to do. So anyway, I that was not necessarily a positive, but it was an enlightening aspect of reactions to the project.
The day that you did your talk in Vancouver, sadly, that was the morning that Tony Negri passed away. And wondering if you could, at least for some of our listeners who may not know who Tony Negri is, the majority will know who he is, but just any thoughts that you wanted to share. Of course, somebody you worked very closely with, led an amazing political life that has had so many ramifications and impacts, but somebody really connected to militant political struggle for his whole life.
Yeah, that's hard. That's a lot, but it's true, like you said, and maybe this is just I wanted to thank you for this, it's true. So Tony had died that morning, and then I was driving to Vancouver, and it was nice to be among you all. It was not not an easy period for me. Or day, even, but that was it was the right context to be in, I guess you would say among friends, so that, but not just among friends in a sort of generic way. In a way that, relates to Tony too, of political discussion that is oriented towards action, and organizing, and so that does speak to him well. It's really hard to narrate briefly Tony's life, because it's a lot of it's sort of Hollywood film like, or ought to be a Hollywood film, I suppose. Or I don't know if I should wish that or not, but it might be the best way to do that is just sort of when I wanted to meet him, so I was in my mid-20s. I was a, generic, relatively stupid graduate student. I'd felt at the time that my activist life and my scholarly life were completely divorced from each other. And reading some things that he had written, it seemed to me that Tony had somehow miraculously managed to make the two into one, that his scholarly life and his activist life were intrinsically related. And that's partly why I sought him out. In fact, to meet him, I translated a book of his, a rather erudite book about Spinoza, and then got in touch with him. He was clandestine in France at the time. And so, instead I had, through this friend, I said I have translation problems, in this book, and he said, we'll come to Paris for a week and we'll talk about translation questions. And then it was great. We had a good time that week. He said, when you move to Paris, how can you turn down an invitation like that? So I moved to Paris. So anyway, I think that is, though, what I really meant to say was maybe the first thing that people should know about him was that he was able to, it's not only that he was able to have an activist life and that he was able to have a scholarly life. He was able to make his scholarly life directly inform his organizing and his activism, and to make his activism and organizing directly inform like I say, even the most erudite type things like Baruch Spinoza or Descartes or Kant or whatever he wrote about. And that's quite a trick. I think when we talk about engaged intellectuals, say in the Sartre sense, that's something different. Yeah, we can think of many people we know that, this has been, even sometimes continues to be me, unfortunately, which is like, you have a day job as an intellectual at the university or professor, and then you have a night job where you do organizing and you participate in movements. Anyway, that's a first thing that might get people interested in Tony who don't know him and try to seek out his work for that reason. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I know that our time is running out here, but just in terms of what are you writing and thinking about now? Do you have projects on the go right now?
One thing that's true, I don't know if this is true for you or for all the writers who are listening to this, but every time I finish a project, I feel like there are no more ideas in my head, and there will never be another idea in my head. There's a kind of feeling of whatever, having given everything, and that there's nothing left. Fortunately, so far, there new ideas have come. So I'm a bit in that phase. I'm also having to do some things related to Tony. I mean, in the last period, he was quite sick. We continued working as we had been for 35 years. Every week we talk on the phone. Every other month I would go visit him. And we always had a book. In fact, I always thought it was a condition of our friendship. See, I should come back to your concept there, that there be a book. So it was the excuse, like, why were we talking on the phone so often? Of course, because there's a book, we have to. So even in this period where he was quite ill in the last years, we were always working on a book. And they said about 6 months to me, which I don't know, seemed moving at the time, where he said, look, Michael, I'm not sure I'm going to be alive for a whole nother book, but let's try. And we can think of it in parts. And we've never been the type to publish articles, but if we don't make it to a book, they can be articles. A long way to say that, now I have the responsibility of some of these articles that are more or less in outline form or something like that. So with a kind of fidelity to Tony, I don't know if that's the wrong term, using your fidelity wrong now, but I do feel, it feels like something I should do. It could even be good for me, it's a way of still being together. Still thinking together. Yeah, that's a better way of thinking about it. It's a way of still thinking together, which we find ways of doing that with all kinds of people that we're not, that either are dead or we've never actually met, but we find ways of thinking with them. So that's a good way of thinking about it. You're helping me. I'm going to use that task I have as ways of continue to think together with him.
Michael, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar, and wonderful to speak with you. And I look forward to seeing this work when it comes out in its own time. So,
thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks for listening to our conversation with Michael Hardt. Check out the show notes to find more of Michael's writing and research. If you would like to support our podcast, you can donate at the link in the description below. Your generous donation will help support the podcast's activities and associated public events with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Below the Radar.